Hello, hello. Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Eileen Julian, Director of the Institute for Advanced Study, which sponsors the Branigin Lecture Series. I want to welcome you all. I want to thank you for coming. I think this is going to be a very interesting presentation, and I'm really happy that we're able to do it. This academic year and next year, the Branigin Lecture Series is focusing on the theme of social justice. In fall semester, Cynthia Enlow, research professor in international development, community, and environment at Clark University in Massachusetts, spoke to us on, quote, the geopolitics of your bathtub, why who does your housework matters, end quote. This talk brought out the ways in which gender and globalization, labor and militarism are mightily entangled. It's a surprise, but it was a wonderful lecture. This afternoon, Dr. Janie Cole, our second and final Branigin speaker for 2016-17, will speak on Soiled but Black Lips, Music, Resistance, Race, and Incarceration in Apartheid South Africa. Would that this talk were just a piece of historical interest. But alas, as you all know, it is all too relevant to our own situation in the US and even in Bloomington this very day. The Branigin Lecture Series is funded by an endowment from the estate of Jean Porteous Branigin. Jean Porteous graduated with a degree in English from IUB in 1934 and eventually married Elba Branigin, a lawyer and brother to Indiana's then Governor Branigin. She went on to play an active part in the IU Alumni Association. She was on a number of boards in Johnson County and in Franklin, Indiana. And as a trustee at Franklin College, she established 2 endowment funds in memory of her husband, one a scholarship for students in law, the other an award for high school students interested in journalism. All of this at Franklin College. It is a pleasure for me to acknowledge Mrs. Branigin, and we are extremely appreciative of the award she left in her own name, the Jean Porteous Branigin Lecture Series. She left this then to the Institute for Advanced Study. Branigin lectureships are intended to bring distinguished figures, without regard, I should insist, to their racial, gender, national, religious, sexual identities. These figures in a variety of fields come to visit Indiana University annually. Branigin lectureships are competitive. Lecturers are typically nominated by IU faculty. They spend several days on campus. There is at least one public lecture, and lecturers meet with students and with faculty. I'm especially gratified by the nomination of Dr. Janie Cole because it resonates with the key mission of IU's Institute for Advanced Study since its inception, and that is promoting interdisciplinary collaborations. Dr. Cole is here then, thanks to a quite improbable collaboration, in my view. She was jointly nominated by Professor Alex Lichtenstein, who works on labor history and struggles for racial justice in South Africa and the US, both lands with histories of white supremacy, and Professor Giovanni Zanovello, who is in the Jacobs School and who focuses, among other topics, on music, musical institutions, humanism, and theory in Renaissance Florence and 16th century France. As you may well suspect, Dr. Cole wears several interdisciplinary hats all by herself. I will leave the introduction of Dr. Cole to Alex and Giovanni, as well as the acknowledgement of the many units that have come together to support Dr. Cole's visit this week. Just a final reminder then, to pick up one of the postcards laid out at the very back, on the tables in the back if you don't already have one. Here you will see all of the various sorts of events and opportunities you would have this week to meet with her, to meet with Dr. Cole. And please linger at the end of the lecture today to join us for one-on-one conversation and light refreshments that you will also find laid out on the table at the back of the room. So again, welcome to Dr. Cole and to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to stand here, and I want to extend a welcome to everyone on behalf of the School of Music, and thank the various units and people who collaborated and made this possible. In the first place, Alex Lichtenstein, who during a very casual chat at the end of a committee discovered that we had this friend whom we both wanted to bring to campus. He was very interested in the topic, and so everything started there. So committee work doesn't have to be all a waste of time. And then Dean Richards of the School of Music, who actually, I went and talked to him, and he actually made this possible in the first place by committing the amount of money that, again, allowed us to contact various units and say, this is happening. When things were beginning to take shape, we had a crucial contribution from the Office of the Vice President for International Affairs, again, a considerable sum that made multiple events possible. And last but not least, we had this conversation. We started a conversation with the Institute for Advanced Studies, and they offered to make the main event a Branigin lecture, and they added more resources. But what I especially liked in collaborating with Professor Julian and Suzanne Godby-Inglesby was the amount, the energy and the enthusiasm that they brought into this. It really felt a completely different experience. A number of other units enthusiastically embraced this visit, and what you have on the postcard is the list of public events, but for every public event there are 2 or 3 classes and various meetings that are happening. So Dr. Cole will be leaving here ready to take a few naps and recover, because we're really keeping her busy. And so let me name some of the sponsored. So the African Studies Program, the Center for Documentary Research and Practice, the Black Film Center Archive, the Center for Research on Race and Ethnicity in Society, the Departments of Anthropology, Folklore, Ethnomusicology, and History. Before I introduce our guest, a couple of very quick words to understand what this is from a disciplinary point of view. It is very interdisciplinary, but most people, when they think of musicology, they think of erudites looking at manuscripts and creating editions of musical works and things that can be performed. And this is indeed what we do. We write the history of music, and we look at the documents, but in the last decades of the 20th century, musicology has also started asking new questions that were not as prevalent before. And these questions have to do with how music affects people's lives. Music has the power of changing people, changing people's perspectives. When I found out about this project, it's still in its Kickstarter phase, I immediately gave my contribution, because I thought this was one of the cases in which I could really see public musicology in its best form. And so I was immediately, and I still am, enthusiastic about this. I'm very happy that Dr. Cole has been able to share this experience with us. And let me introduce her as the last thing I'm doing, and then I promise I will disappear. Janie Cole is a musicologist and oral historian with 2 specialty research areas in 20th century South African music, protest, and oral history, during the anti-apartheid struggle era, and in Italian and French music, literature, opera, and cultural history of the late Renaissance and early Baroque periods. She is the author of 2 scholarly books, of music in early Baroque Florence, the poetry of Michelangelo Buonarroti il Giovane, published in Florence in 2007, and Music, Spectacle, and Cultural Brokerage in early modern Italy, 2 volumes, also published in Florence in 2011, as well as numerous articles and publications in journals related to her specialties. Dr. Cole was awarded her doctorate jointly in music and Italian from the University of London, and subsequently worked as a junior specialist in the rare books and manuscript department at Christie's, New York. She has been granted fellowships from the Tatti University Center for Italian Renaissance Studies at Villa Tatti, the Newberry Library, the Medici Archive Project. She won research grants from the Getty Foundation, the Leverhulme Trust, and the Italian Cultural Institute, and has been awarded the Stephen Arlen Award from English National Opera and the Jane Levy Prize from the American Musicological Society. She's a member of the Renaissance Society of America Council, is discipline representative in musicology of also the Renaissance Society of America, and is a member of the editorial advisory board of Renaissance Quarterly. And the most relevant part to what we're hearing today, she is the founder and executive director of Music Beyond Borders, and is currently a visiting professor at the University of Cape Town's Center for African Studies and the South African College of Music, where she lectures in historical musicology and ethnomusicology. She's a research fellow on the Mellon-funded project based at the University of Cape Town on recentering Afro-Asia, musical and human migrations in the pre-colonial period 700-1500 AD. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jane Cole.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here with you all at Indiana University, and I wanted to warmly thank Professor Zanovello and Professor Lichtenstein for putting together this wonderful program that we have here, and especially Professor Julian and Suzanne Godby for hosting me today at the IAS. Tortured and locked up in solitary confinement in a police cell at John Vorster Square, Johannesburg in 1980, Grant Shezzy was a political prisoner held for his part in fighting for racial equality during the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. Shezzy went on to spend 10 years incarcerated at the maximum security prison of Robben Island for acts of terrorism through his membership of Umkhonto we Sizwe, the military wing of the banned African National Congress. In our recent interview, Shezzy recalled how in detention, singing and especially musical memory were crucial to his resistance. He said, quote, "You are kept in detention. You are alone. That moment, it's a port of death. So singing is not allowed, talking is not allowed, and you won't even know where you are. Singing with your heart in silence, it sustains you, it composes you. You remember the songs that you used to sing and the songs that were sung during the times of the Anglo-Zulu wars of resistance among Zulus. Those songs gave me power to face the enemy when I was all alone and knew that here they can kill me." Shezzy's comment gives us insight into how music can sustain and provide a form of resistance to overcome extreme physical and psychological stress or hardship by drawing on a musical memory bank of songs associated with specific, often positive, life-affirming experiences or moments. In apartheid South Africa, the critical role of music as a mode of resistance in the liberation struggle cannot be overestimated. In 1948, the white supremacist government enforced a system of legal racial segregation of apartheid, meaning separateness in Afrikaans. The Nationalist Party's policy introduced a range of race laws and regulations that suppressed the social and civil rights of the majority of black inhabitants and privileged white minority interests. Against a backdrop of popular uprisings, mass protests, guerrilla movements, and illegal meetings of the banned political parties, music played a pivotal role, tracing the history of the struggle for democracy and racial equality and evolving in direct response to the changing political climate and conditions across the country. Music was introduced as a peaceful mode of critique which undermined the government and as a means of mobilizing thousands of repressed non-white and multi-ethnic inhabitants across 9 provinces, especially through a rich repertory of so-called freedom songs. This is clear from countless personal testimonies of the liberation movement, yet there is a scarcity of musicological studies about this repertory, and a wealth of surviving archival resources has remained unexamined. Broader social histories of Black South African musical styles, traditions, and performance genres from this period by David Copeland, Christopher Ballantyne, and Veit Ullmann provide invaluable analyses of the musical soundscape developing both prior and during the apartheid era, but not any of its detail in direct relation to the struggle specifically. Nor have ethnomusicologists considered music's central role as a tool for prisoner resistance and defiance in the apartheid prisons and temporary police holding cells, where the different pillars of the liberation struggle interlaced, with the exception of a doctoral thesis in history by Nia Ramupi, which provides a cultural history of Robben Island with political songs at its core. Drawing on new first-hand interviews with surviving former political prisoners and perpetrators, which I've been conducting over the last few years, and archival documents, my lecture today will explore music's critical role as a force for resistance and survival in the liberation movement, and in particular at the notorious Robben Island prison, where Nelson Mandela was imprisoned for 18 of his 27 years spent behind bars, together with approximately 4,000 other black, so-called coloured, meaning of mixed race in South African race parlance, and Indian male activists from the early 1960s on. Since accounts of Robben Island tend to concentrate on the conditions of its most famous inmates, principally Mandela, Ahmed Kathrada, and other liberation leaders, in the single isolation cells, which are Section B of the prison, my focus is, in contrast, on the unknown political prisoners in the communal sections, where music making was much more varied and prolific. How did informal music making function as a space where those marginalized by an oppressed regime could find a voice? How could music, especially singing, sustain political prisoners in harrowing conditions? First, the genre of freedom songs will be explored in the wider struggle to provide the soundscape for political activists. Then I will show how music held an essential place in prison life and reveal how black music performance, from indigenous African genres like isicathamiya, maskanda, kwela, baklanga, and marabi, to Cape jazz, traditional migrant work songs, classical, rock, reggae, and Indian ragas, provided resistance, critique, community, therapy, memory, and identity for political prisoners. Music provided also a tool to survive hard labor in the prison stone quarries, where traditional Zulu migrant workers' songs expressed accounts of racial repression. And lastly, music making provided unique social interactions between white warders and black prisoners, slowly breaking down racial prejudices and initiating a process of reconciliation. This study will ultimately show how music transcended political, tribal, and linguistic differences to become a force for prisoner resistance, which united and oppressed people against a common enemy and became the symbolic expression of a multiracial and multicultural country. This model of cultural expression as advancing social change and broader theories of music as resistance and music inciting violence in race relations can serve for the wider study of music exploited by individuals suffering and protesting the violation of human rights under oppressive regimes. In Southern Africa, especially South Africa, where singing is the primary cultural expression, as opposed to the dominant drumming cultures of Western Africa, it was natural for popular expression, especially by a marginalized and oppressed community, to find a vehicle in song. The genre of freedom songs was the dominant musical medium of popular political expression in the struggle for racial equality both before and during apartheid. In fact, the genre long predated the legal start of apartheid, 1948, whose ideology stretched back to the first colonial conquests in the Cape in the mid-16th century, 1652, in a familiar pattern of exploitation and oppression of the black population. Following late 19th and early 20th century protest models by composers such as John Knox Bokwe and Enoch Sontonga, musicians gave rise to political consciousness through songs that grew out of mass gatherings, bloody defiance campaigns, strikes, funerals, and other protest actions against apartheid, which represented their collective identity. Vuyisile Mini, a trade union organizer and African National Congress member, composed many well-known protest songs, including Masoba vi Fefut Nancy Dodemia, Beware Fefut, Here's the Black Man, Isa Kunyateli Africa, Africa Will Trample You, and Tatontualo, Take Up Your Luggage. I'm just going to play for you one of these tracks. Nancy Dodemia warned, quote, "Here is a black man, be careful, here is a black man," to Hendrik Verwoerd, who was the current prime minister at the time. And there's this warning that they're giving in a repeated melodic motif. So these protest songs express political critique from different parties against the apartheid regime. They galvanized the masses, mobilizing thousands of multi-ethnic inhabitants across 9 provinces. They were a form of communication by sending secret messages, hiding protest slogans or banned materials in the texts, and they were constantly evolving to suit the changing socio-political panorama. Freedom songs circulated in numerous variants with additional verses and slightly altered melodies, or with new names and events added as historical circumstances changed. Most of these songs were composed and disseminated through an oral tradition, and their stylistic origins were in makwaya, meaning choir, choral music, a widely popular genre that combined indigenous Southern African features like praise singing with Christian hymnody. Generic Methodist Western 4-part harmony was combined with African musical traditions, such as the call and response style, whereby pieces are constructed by choral motifs and solo sections, the solos representing the call and the motivic responses sections are the response. Other indigenous African principles are found in the harmonic framework, which is based on cyclicity, whereby a short harmonic cycle is repeated over which a series of short melodic motifs are varied. Freedom songs were like short slogans, sung in indigenous languages, primarily Xhosa, Zulu, and Sotho, and English, and set to simple melodic phrases sung a cappella and repeated over and over again in a call and response style. Many traditional freedom songs were common to different political parties and considered universal, such as the very famous Senzeni Na, What Have We Done, in Xhosa and Zulu, which combines Western 4-part harmony with call and response and African cyclical harmonic structures. The central question, what have we done, is sung repeatedly in different harmonic and melodic configurations. Other songs express political identity. Each political party adopted their particular freedom songs. The African National Congress, the ANC, the main opposition party, identified with freedom songs which were mostly adaptations of wedding songs and hence joyous and exuberant. Sadiq Isaacs, incarcerated on Robben Island in 1964 for 13 years for acts of terrorism, recalls how, quote, One of the more stirring songs of the ANC was known as the First Nationale, which was actually sung to the tune of the German carol, O Tannenbaum, about, quote, "the people's flag is deepest red, its shrouded oft are martyred dead," unquote. Many songs of the Pan-Africanist Congress, the PAC, a breakaway group of the ANC formed under the leadership of Robert Sobukwe in 1959, with an ideological basis in a Pan-African vision, were adaptations from devotional music, with texts reflecting Pan-African themes and liberation. One such example is Give a Thought to Africa, a highly politically charged song adapted from the Christian hymn Give a Thought to Jesus, composed after the 1960 Sharpeville massacre. PAC references are found in lines such as Tell the Life of Sobukwe. And this particular recording I'm going to play for you today was actually sung by Ike Makiti, who was present at the 1960 Sharpeville massacre. In fact, Ike survived the massacre because his mother had insisted that he go home for lunch. So he wasn't actually present when the police started firing on the crowd. And this recording comes from a group of former Robben Island political prisoners who we got together into the recording studios in Johannesburg and got them to record 13 tracks that they had sung on the island. Most of them have been unrecorded. They remained in their memories. They remembered all the texts. They practiced for about half an hour in the car park beforehand. It was very emotional because they hadn't seen each other since they'd been on the island. And bear in mind, these aren't professional musicians. They're everyday people with wonderful voices. And Ike, who's singing the main solo part here, is now in his 80s.
Give a thought to Africa, 'neath the burning sun. There are voices crying out for the living God. Many hearts have passed away, but on land and sea there are voices crying out for the living God. Tell the love of Sobukwe by the hills and waters. God bless Africa and the sons and daughters.
Struggle songs from the early 1950s, period of relatively peaceful opposition, represent a much less militant stance, whereas after the 1906 Sharpeville massacre, songs became a call to arms, with often aggressive and violent texts. This reflected the political watershed of Sharpeville, when on the 21st of March 1960, the South African police opened fire on a crowd of peaceful black demonstrators, killing 69 people, including many children. After which the ANC turned to armed struggle with the formation of Umkhonto we Sizwe, MK, meaning the spear of the nation. The performance context, time and space were also central to the effectiveness of this repertory in capturing and transmitting memory and identity, as well as for mobilizing resistance to or averting violence in bloody confrontational protest situations. To take Slavoj Žižek's conception of music in his 2008 study of violence, that, quote, "it comes in just when words fail, and that music can be used to, quote, keep violence at a distance," unquote. And yet the more militant call to arms struggle songs like Kill the Boer, which evolved after 1960 and well into the 1980s during the state of emergency, could instead incite violence. According to Žižek's categorizations of violence into different forms, including subjective, direct physical or psychological violence, and objective, symbolic and systemic, struggle songs could be defined as objective violence, i.e. containing racist hate speech, discrimination, and symbolic violence embodied in language and its forms. A formidable synergy of individuals is created when a group sings the same song in unison and performs the same body movements. Individuals work for the effectiveness of the group in turn empowers every individual. The unison of struggle songs sung en masse correlates with the strong sense of family and community in Southern African traditions. The performance space also, outside, impromptu, singing in organised mass protests, often in the presence of heavily armed security police, meant most were sung a cappella, when instruments were usually not available. However, instrumentation did play a role in their effectiveness and intensity. Drums and percussion instruments emphasise militancy and intimidation in most struggle songs. To create a strong central rhythm, many lyrics are repeated, such as in the famous Senzeni Now, which we heard earlier. Claps and stomps are used as a way to unify a group in one physical movement, as well as whistling and Zulu Xhosa ululation. Another form of rhythm is found in the language itself. Many of them are sung in click languages, like Xhosa, where certain consonants take on a tongue click, tying rhythm and sound together to represent the pulse of black South African cultures in the face of white cultural domination. I'm going to play to you now this example, Oliver Tambo, Take My Hand, which comes from the South African History Archive recording, where you can hear these elements very clearly, especially the ululation. Former struggle activists testified that the songs were designed to take them to a particular state of mind and a state of transcendence to fuel the adrenaline needed to face potential violence or even death. The constant repetition of melodic phrases could provide this state of mind for protesters who must be prepared for anything. The concept of transcendence is related to traditional indigenous beliefs in the region, specifically Xhosa traditions, which use music to create a certain state of transcendence as a conduit for communicating with their ancestors in the afterlife. And in this interview clip, Mark Shinners and Anthony Suze is on the left. They're both former Robben Island political prisoners. And here they express very clearly this state of mind that is induced by the songs.
Songs are inspirational. They create the mood. And so if you want to go into a fight, you sing. And the song will befit that particular moment. And as Mark has said, the struggle, you would not get into the struggle without the struggle or into a fight situation without the right frame of mind. And how do you create that frame of mind? You sing, and the song becomes an opium, the opium that takes over the body, mind, and soul. And once you are transfixed in that situation, your fears vanish. And instead, if you are angry, your anger heightens. And so that's what music did in the struggle. And in prison, we use music to either show our anger, to lighten our misery, and just to celebrate situations. When we are happy, we sing certain kinds of songs. When we are depressed and sorry, we sing certain kinds of songs.
For many activists, the price of struggle was incarceration. The notorious Robben Island maximum security prison became symbolic as the epitome of the apartheid prison. Prison life on Robben Island, situated 7 kilometres off the west coast of Cape Town, was brutal, abusive and harrowing, especially during the 1960s and 70s when living conditions were at their most basic. Squashed into old and overcrowded military dormitories, political prisoners slept on wafer-thin sisal mats with stinking lice-infested blankets. There they were locked up with common law prisoners, South Africa's most notorious murderers, rapists, gang leaders, and violent criminals. They were subjected to back-breaking hard labour in the stone and lime quarries, and a daily treatment of abuse and beatings by sadistic warders was the norm. A meagre diet strictly rationed along racial lines left a healthy body emaciated in a matter of weeks. And you can see here with this diet, how the diet chart shows the very different rations given to the different racial categories on each side. So more protein on one side, bread not on the other. In such a climate of extreme physical and psychological adversity, music became a key to survival. Political and freedom songs were adopted by the two major political organisations, the ANC and PAC, represented by sheer numbers on Robben Island. For example, a well-known freedom song sung at protests, and also in the liberation movement in Namibia, was Unsima Lontwalo. The ethos behind it is to overcome the burden, make it bearable by coming together. The song was sung at political meetings in their cells on the island.
Unzima lomthwalo ofuna madoda. Unzima lomthwalo ofuna madoda. Asikhathale noma siyaboshwa, sizimisele inkululeko. Asikhathale noma siyaboshwa, sizimisele inkululeko.
Another song was Yeyanina Lengshukumo, meaning, what is this commotion all about? And this was composed by Robert Sobukwe after the 1960 Sharpeville massacre and was sung only by PAC veterans in their cells.
Yeyanina Lengshukumo, kubo bacindezeli, kungenxa kamangaliso, inkokheli yethu, ngokufuna izwe lethu.
But the vast majority of musical activity on the island was not politically orientated. Outside of their respective political education and practices, political prisoners were united by two fundamental concepts: opposition to apartheid and stopping the prison from breaking their spirits. So they focused on cultural activities that would keep their minds active and their schedules busy and would fundamentally bring them together. A profound sense of community was created by music making, which crossed political affiliations, tribal identities, and linguistic differences. Lionel Davis, sentenced in 1964 for 7 years for conspiracy to commit acts of sabotage as a member of the National Liberation Front, said, quote, "I didn't know Xhosa. One of our cell guys was Xhosa speaking. He would teach us songs. He would sing revolutionary songs, and we always sang." Another former prisoner I interviewed, Cecil Esau, who spent 4 years on the island from 1987, recounted how, quote, "There was a fellow Timothy. He was held next to my cell, and when I used to exercise, then I would sing as I would walk. And one day he called me speaking Xhosa, and I burst out laughing. I said, 'I can't speak Xhosa, I can only sing it.'" One such uniting song was the well-known protest number by Ruben Kaluza against the 1913 Land Act, Eland Africa, We Are the Children of Africa, originally adopted by the ANC as its anthem before being replaced by Nkosi Sikelel' Africa in 1925. With the opening verse, Sikalela Izwe Lakiti, uniting different tribal groups against their common oppressor in a process of nation building. "We are crying for our country, which was taken by the robbers. Zulus, Xhosas, Sutus, unite."
Sikalela izwe lakithi, sikalela izwe lakithi, lona elathathwa ngabokalajana, lona elathathwa ngabokalajana. Sikalela izwe lakithi, sikalela izwe lakithi, lona elathathwa ngabokalajana, lona elathathwa ngabokalajana. Siwele wezulu, Xhosa, Msuthu hlangana. Siwele wezulu, Xhosa, Msuthu hlangana.
Songs were also used to transmit their anti-apartheid messages to the outside world. Thulani Mabaso, sentenced in 1983 for 18 years, described how, quote, "Our songs were smuggled out by our lawyers, the texts, even the scores, Music was sending a message to the world. What do we feel? What is happening? We even composed songs for an opera about apartheid, which was smuggled out. And music was also used as a tool to survive depression, what the prisoners called cracking, providing a source of strength, therapy, and comfort. Lionel Davis remarked how, quote, singing is part of the cultural life of South Africans, especially black South Africans. Singing is part of our very rich culture. Every facet of our life is celebrated through music. So when you go to jail, the tradition continues. When you are down, music uplifts the spirit, gives you hope. You cannot stop a political prisoner from talking. You cannot stop an African from singing. Nights were often the worst when homesickness seeped in. Thinking of their loved ones back home, many left penniless without a breadwinner, under constant surveillance and persecuted by the security police for their proximity to an activist. Folk songs such as Izika Zika Malalela, the buttocks of the unemployed are hard as concrete, and Amakome Duse, come closer, sweetheart, daddy is here. These expressed their homesickness, anguish, and sorrow.
Sondela mtawethu nangu baba amakamduze sondela mtawethu nangu baba amakamduze sondela mtawethu nangu baba.
Moses Dlamini, arrested in 1963 for being a member of a banned political party, recalled in his memoirs how one night after another grueling day in the quarry, he began an old nationalist song, Tina Sizwe, which had been sung by their grandfathers during the passive resistance campaigns and became one of the most famous, popular freedom songs. Dlamini observed that, quote, as we sang it, I could see that the morale of the comrades was going up. When we repeated it again, we seemed to have been rejuvenated. This famous universal freedom song cries for the black nation. We the black nation, we the black nation. We cry for all our land that was taken by the white people. Nearly every political prisoner I have interviewed has mentioned the significance of Tina Sizwe in very different prison contexts, including the women's jails, which is another story.
Tina Sizwe,
Tina Sizwe,
Music making on Robben Island took many forms, with the formation of choirs and bands, the organisation of singing competitions and concerts with a wide range of musical styles, from jazz, Afro-jazz and reggae to classical, popular and rock. Robben Island was noteworthy for its number of different choirs and groups, counting at least 9 in 1965. It was distinguished also from other apartheid prisons because political prisoners were serving long-term sentences, and hence regular musical activities and groups were established. Prisoners also made their own musical instruments out of whatever materials they could lay their hands on. Vusi Nelson Kumani, who was imprisoned for 12 years, spent many hours constructing a saxophone out of dried weed he had collected from the beach next to the quarry. Political prisoners also imported various black performance genres which developed out of the industrialization and mass labor migration from the rural areas at the end of the 19th century, such as maskanda, gumboots, and isikatamia. Through a remarkable transformation, all three traditions moved during the 20th century from being performances by largely illiterate Zulu-speaking migrant men from KwaZulu-Natal into genres of performance performed worldwide. Isikatamia traces its roots to mission hymnody, the 4-part soprano, alto, tenor, bass, and the visit of African-American performer Orpheus Makedu and the Virginia Jubilee Singers to South Africa in the 1890s. As the performance aesthetics shifted in the 20th century, so has the name. With these imports onto the island, the political prisoners replicated the black urban population's adoption of these distinct musical forms, as analysed at length by Veit Ehrman in his 2 books. And like the migrant workers and dispossessed farm labourers living far from home in all-men hostels and townships in the industrial cities of Johannesburg, Kimberley and Durban, the Robben Island men drew on a long tradition of self-invented Saturday night entertainment. thus reenacting the very musical activities that they would have been involved in their everyday life as free migrant workers. Thus, in 1965, several vocal groups emerged: the Islanders, the Robinaires, the Summit Tones, and the Flames. The peasant and migrant labourers from the Transkei and Paarl areas formed their own isicathamiya choirs in their cells, such as the Morning Star, consisting of PAC members, and held weekly competitions against each other. Workers from the Port Elizabeth area, mostly ANC members, followed suit with groups such as the Leopards Choir. Names were typical of isicathamiya choirs, often used names that were popular with soccer teams or adopted from stories in mission school readers, or they were even used by criminal gangs. The migrant worker prisoners also typically revived the structures and networks of homeboy-based associations, drawing on common regional origin and kinship ties to provide some measure of stability in an uncertain environment. Music concerts were organised on Sunday afternoons for entertainment and to alleviate the tedium of long weekends. They provided a welcome respite from the quarry, yet stretched out endlessly, only to be punctuated by breakfast at 7 a.m, lunch at 11 a.m, and supper at 2 p.m. Singing groups would practice in earnest during the week in preparation for their weekend performance, also composing original works for the programme. On Sunday afternoon in 1965, for example, Moses Lamini recounts in his memoir how there was to be a competition of isicathamiya between the peasant choirs in Section D, Cell 2, another concert of popular music by the Islanders and the Flames in Section A, Cell 2. The Robinaires were performing in the Zinktronk, and the Choir of 100 Voices was performing classical music in Section C, Cell 1. More ambitious musical projects were also performed: a production of Handel's Messiah by the Choir of 100 Voices, which specialized in classical music, conducted by a former teacher. This drew on a long tradition of African performances of Handel's choral music, especially the Hallelujah Chorus, which, according to Christopher Cockburn, was standard fare for black choirs in the townships around Johannesburg. Original compositions were also performed, which mirrored and served as social commentary on socio-political developments on the mainland. One was a musical setting based on the Sharpeville massacre. And Sadiq Isaacs remarked how, he commented how the work, quote, reminded me a bit of Tchaikovsky's 1812 overture. The cadence of guns firing was built into the music. And I'm still trying to find a score of this work. Apparently one does remain somewhere. These musical activities brought relief to the daily back-breaking hard labour in the stone quarry. Men wielded hammers weighing over 13 pounds, sweated and toiled, talked and debated, and sang for 8 hours to the point of exhaustion. African work songs at Robben Island provided both a rhythmic work pace and a sense of unity in overcoming the daily hardships. Work songs drew on a tradition of migrant labourers' work songs and folk songs which were widespread in apartheid South Africa. Work songs from the 1970s were especially full of profanities and offered satirical commentaries about their white oppressors and the state of the nation. Specific songs were sung on the various labour tasks of Robben Island, which ensured a cohesive work rhythm and lightened the burden somewhat. For example, on the pickaxe span, where prisoners dug trenches, they lifted their pickaxes up in unison and swung them down into the ground with a unanimous grunt. Malcolm Esconditi would break out into a mournful traditional Zulu song, Ekuseni, full of yearning and hope. Everybody in the span would join in a call and response style, with the lead singer singing at a higher octave and weaving a melody into the cyclical rhythmic motif sung by the chorus. Ekuseni, we talk about parole in the morning. Listen, we pity those still coming. Mama failed when giving birth. She gave birth to a rogue. Another song was called Isandla Funindau. After a stone had been freshly quarried out of the rock face by the hammers, a rope was tied around it, and it was dragged out of the ditch and up a smooth incline to the loading area by a double row of men on the rope span. The extra effort required to pull the stone out of the ditch required a more powerful chant or song. Often a chant would start off softly, repeated over and over like a mantra, and slowly increasing in volume and urgency. Isandla Funindau, Funindau, Isandla Funindau, Funindau. It's a call for hands. Let the hand find a holding place, lend a shoulder. As everyone clutched the rope, the words changed to Isandla genalap, genalap, push your hand into the space, in preparation for the huge physical effort that would follow as the tempo and volume of the chant increased and peaked, each prisoner echoing the leader. Finally, when the leader judged that everyone was ready, he abruptly changed the chant to a grunting, where each strenuous pull was applied in unison on ku, ensukinsu ku, ensukinsu ku. Now we lift. When the song came out of the ditch and landed, the stone came out of the ditch and landed on the level ground before the incline, a grunt of unanimous satisfaction could be heard. Kukomoya, meaning take a breather. And then a brief respite ensued while the lead singer would sing, Abalung, God damn, white man, God damn you. And here I want to play this clip here that, so this is the group of Robben Island political prisoners that we got into the recording studio, and these work songs had never been recorded before, and as they sang, they actually just started doing the physical motion very, very, very naturally and coordinated, which was how they remembered it.
We ready, go.
Ready?
Sun, falling down, sun, falling down, falling down, falling down, sun, falling down, sun, falling down, sun, falling down, sun, falling down, falling down, falling down, sun, falling down, sun, falling down, falling down, falling down, sun, falling down, sun, falling down, falling down, falling down, sun, pelele, Santa, pelele, Santa, pelele, Santa, pelele, Santa, pelele, Santa, pelele. Yasuginsim, ku, Yasuginsim, ku, Yasuginsim, ku, Yasuginsim, ku, Yasuginsim, ku, Yasuginsim. Shelele, kum shelele, kum shelele, kum shelele. Abelu gotem, abelu gotem. Basibiza ngo John, basibiza ngo John. Abelu gotem, abelu gotem. Basibiza ngo John, basibiza ngo John. Basibiza ngo Jim, basibiza ngo Jim. Basibiza ngo John, basibiza ngo John. Abelu gotem, abelu gotem. Abelu gotem, abelu gotem. Easy.
Another song sung in the Stone Quarry, which is lesser known, is this Gosa work song, Isifuku Fukwana Semluguana, which actually poked fun at the white guards. It says, this white fool guarding over us is a crybaby. So how did they get away with this? Talking was forbidden, but warders tolerated the prisoners singing whilst they worked because they believed it helped them to be more productive. Christo Brand, a warder on Robben Island from 1978 to 1992, commented how, quote, they were not allowed to sing freedom songs in prison. It was illegal. But it happened anyway. Sometimes we leave them while they are working. It's a tradition of African people. This was ironic since many of the work songs condemned the white man, called for action, or lamented the condition of the black oppressed people. But most of the guards had little knowledge of other African languages except Afrikaans and believed the songs were simply traditional work songs from the prisoners' tribal homelands, which helped them to work faster, and therefore they encouraged them or even sang along. Political prisoners made use of their labour time in other more constructive ways, discussing academic topics, political principles, and teaching political theory. They form part of a wider, these activities form part of a wider ideological definition of the prison as a university of the struggle, so coined by Nelson Mandela and other leaders, whose aim was to encourage political prisoners to educate themselves, create study and discussion groups, and gain degrees via correspondence learning. Thus, prisoners taught each other, including music theory, music appreciation, and music history, as well as instrumental playing. As part of this ethos, the Prisoners' Record Club, the PRC, was set up in the early 1970s by the prisoners to build a music library and have daily listening programs of all genres of music. In fact, the PRC archival paces are numerous. They're actually in the Mayebui archives, and they comprise endless committee reports, minutes of meetings and agendas, and lists of donations. You can see in this example is a weekly music program, and then here you can see this donation list. Each prisoner has donated a certain amount. So they're very, very meticulous about keeping the documentation. And you also find letters of complaint. So here's one example, which says, and it's you can see how it's a proper letter. You've got Prisoners' Record Club at the address in the top right-hand corner, Robben Island, 18th of July, 1973. It's addressed to the officer on duty, local, and it says, "Sir, kindly clean the needle after playing each side. We would appreciate it if you could start playing immediately after we are locked up, so that all the sides may be played. Thank you. Yours faithfully, and the secretary. So here you can see the sense of irony, the sense of humor, and this kind of psychological warfare that they were constantly waging against the warders to get what they want. And they were highly organized. And in several interviews I've done, prisoners have confirmed to me that the idea was to practice the diplomatic and administrative skills that they would one day need, that they knew that they would need to run their country as a free democratic nation. And many prisoners were actually educated musically through the PRC, due in part to the range of multicultural and multi-ethnic backgrounds in the prison population. Sadiq Isaac described how he was, quote, introduced to the ragas of Indian music and the jazz of the townships known as Baklanga, which is a coalition of Marabi and Kwela. It originated in the 1960s, and also to the music called Fourth Stream, which was a mixture of classics and jazz. Eugene Mokoasi recalled how a fellow Zulu prisoner violently reacted to hearing classical music. He said, "My single cell was opposite a Zulu prisoner. The music program had been compiled by fellows from B section who would always inundate the program with classics. And Gosso was like screaming and shouting and kicking the door, and he says to me in Zulu, 'Tell these bloody bastards to switch off this rubbish.' It was stringed music. Bach, I think. 'What the hell is this? It's driving me crazy.' This guy is from rural KwaZulu. His exposure to white South Africa is minimal, if not zilch. He knows only his world, so for him, that is absolute harassment, torture." And lastly, the attitudes of the white warders, the majority being young and uneducated, brainwashed by the state to view all political prisoners as subversive terrorists who wanted to overthrow the government. These interactions and attitudes gradually evolved through these interactions with the political prisoners. They were shocked to find educated, polite, clean, and friendly intellectuals with whom they could talk. Racial prejudices were slowly broken down over time, oiled by musical interactions. Lionel Davis recalls how, quote, "There was one warder, he would come on duty, he used to love his tipple, and he would bring a guitar with him illegally and make music for us. Or he would borrow a melodica from one of us. We would love him to come." In a letter to Sylvia Neame from December 1970, Ahmed Kathrada, imprisoned for 18 years in the single cells next to Mandela, remarked how, quote, "Ironically, it is in jail that we have closest fraternization between the opponents and supporters of apartheid. We have eaten of their food and they ours. They have blown the same musical instruments that have been soiled by black lips." To conclude, Steve Biko, leader of the Black Consciousness Movement, who was murdered in detention at Pretoria Central Prison in 1977, recognized the potency of song as resistance. He said, "Any suffering we experience was made much more real by song and rhythm, which promotes a culture of defiance, self-assertion, and group pride and solidarity. Song provided political expression, therapy, identity, memory, resilience, and a state of mind to confront potential violence and death. Music undoubtedly played a critical role as a form of prisoner resistance and defiance at Robben Island prison, where male communities, diversified by tribal, racial, and language identities, turned political oppression and physical imprisonment to political advantage via the idioms of African sacred and popular song. The story of how music provided women activists with a voice to express their committed presence in the liberation struggle for racial and gender equality, especially in the women's prisons, is another part of the struggle narrative which has been historically overlooked. These questions will serve to clarify how prison music united the different pillars of struggle and to reveal the musical repertories that fueled profound social change and protested the violation of human rights in South Africa during the apartheid era and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you. We don't have a lot of time, but perhaps we can take a couple of questions.
Oh, thank you. Okay. Actually, there's so much. It's so rich. Thank you so much for this presentation. I wanted to ask a question that really has to do with the difference you signaled at the very beginning between the drumming of West Africa versus the song of Southern Africa. Can you give us some insight into the ways, the genealogy of song, how song developed, why it was so important in Southern Africa?
In Southern Africa, song has always been there for, as we know, for hundreds and hundreds of generations. And it's part of the work ethos. So you see it in the traditions of work songs. You see it on a stoop. You see it, in all different kinds of contexts in that way. And so I think, once you get to the apartheid era, those traditions which have been there for generations and hundreds of years come out in that struggle context. In terms of the Western drumming cultures of Western Africa, those drumming cultures, I don't know what the differences are between that genealogy, but they're very, very distinct developments in terms of regional distinctions in that sense. And so I think that is why in Southern Africa there's any kind of political expression would automatically find its way, its expression in song. One of the things that most struck me about Robben Island was that when I first started working on this research was that people talked about, and researchers there's been a lot of research about how literature was such an important part for liberating their mind, for reading, on the island. And there was a copy of Shakespeare's complete works that was smuggled into the prison space. And in order to keep it, one of the prisoners covered it in images of Hindu gods and goddesses, so it looked like a Bible. And the guards didn't realize what it was. So they kept it, and it was circulated among the prisoners, and each one of them put their initials into in their favorite passages. And Mandela's initials are next to a passage from Julius Caesar, which says, cowards die many times before their death. And it's since become known as the Robben Island Bible. It's in the Stratford Museum in England. And so, there are other cultural forms like literature, and like sport that formed part of this resistance. But as a musicologist, perhaps that was also, my inclination. But just looking at the centrality of singing as part of South African, in that cultural makeup, there had to be music, there had to be singing. It was the obvious question: where's the music?
Thank you also so much for everything that you've brought to us this afternoon. It's really spectacular. Since 1994, things have shifted dramatically in the country. And you would imagine that music has taken on different forms and songs have sort of morphed or sort of evolved into different... Do you have a sense of how this tradition of singing, and specifically the songs related to freedom and emancipation, have sort of transformed through the decades since 1994? Anything surprising there, or anything that strikes you as being sort of significant to the circumstances of the country as they are today?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and a very leading one. I mean, in terms of the struggle period, the freedom songs and other songs related to specifically the apartheid period, you see how they evolve and all the variations, and the texts change and the melodies change. Looking now, fast-forwarding, we've had these very volatile and recent protests at the university and tertiary institutions around the country, which erupted in 2015 for the Roads Must Fall, which then became Fees Must Fall, and then recently in 2016 we've had the whole Fees Must Fall, which I've been seen up close. I've participated in some of the marches and recorded quite a lot of what was going on. I even at one point had protesters march into my lecture room and demand that I stop lecturing. This happened to lots of faculty. And ironically, I was actually giving a lecture on this material. So there was the PowerPoint was showing, there was a freedom song blaring out. And they came in and said, you know, you must stop lecturing, and you're stopping the students from joining our cause outside. I said, oh, okay, well, would you like to join us? Because I'm actually, we're giving a class about the history of the struggle, and there might be some songs that you can add to your repertory outside. And obviously, adrenaline's fueling, and you're trying to dilute the situation and deal with the immediate, I wouldn't say threat, but it was quite volatile. And these young students were shocked to see, that this was going on in the classroom, and actually retreated and said, oh, maybe another time, and they went outside. But what I've noticed is that within, whenever they've been marching on campus, I'm at UCT, at the University of Cape Town, you hear them before you see them. So, there's always the music, the singing, and a lot of the struggle era freedom songs are being sung. But interestingly, it seems to be, and don't quote me on this because this isn't, I haven't studied every single thing that they're singing, but my sense at the moment is that a lot of them are PAC songs. They're not drawing on the ANC repertory, which to me seems that there's some need to distance from the present government, or in that respect. But yeah, it's interesting times.
So if there are no questions, we can continue the conversation or the refreshment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.